So we usually start a little bit late because we have people possibly coming from other departments. But thank you, Maisie, thank you, I think Rita and Krishna, who is for organizing. But this is part of BMXR. Yes, XR, if you don't know, it's this network we are trying to build up with area with a lot of people, create a community of research and impact around virtual augmented reality. We recently have our University of Aberdeen webpage about BMXR. We have a little bit of connection also with Pure, so we have collected, I think, 5,000 papers that have been published at the University of Birmingham, having to do to some degree with virtual and augmented and mixed reality and wearable and metaverse and all the terms that you can think of. We are trying to do a little bit of a push to create more activity around VR, AR. And the push here we're trying to do is have talks from different speakers. So we have the first round of having Gavin that visits for another talk. So we take this opportunity to invite him and talk also about virtual reality. Just to give you a sense, like last month, we went and visited the extended Extreme Robotic Lab. So it's a lab in metallurgy where they have lots of robots, lots of VR, haptic devices. So we're trying to connect with different, there was before, like CTL, we had before a talk at the CTL, Center for Teaching and Learning. Collaborative Teaching Laboratory, where they are doing training for chemical lab in virtual reality. So we also had a talk on training social worker, I think I mentioned before, in virtual reality. So it's a range of topics. I think Eyal also gave a talk at one point on your experience, like haptics, and so very different, very interdisciplinary. So we are trying to be approachable. So we have a few people from psychology. I see a few people from computer science. So just to give you a bit of the sense of what the audience is. As I said, we also record and we make it available to other members that might be able. So first of all, thank you for being here and for allowing us to hear this interesting talk. I know your research from before, but I see you have also a demo, so I give you the floor.
Thank you. One thing, it says BHAM-XR, but it's open for other universities just as well. You can join, and people in the university that you're interested can join. It's only going to be once a month, not a lot of. Then you could watch the talks.
I could definitely see myself being a regular virtual attendee at these things.
Very good.
I mean, thanks so much for having me here today. I'm a big fan of much of the work that goes on, not just in the touch and VR side, but, generally speaking, the psychology department and the computer science department here anyway. So it's pretty exciting for me to be here. I'm going to give a talk that is in 3 parts. None of it's going to be very deep. It's going to be pretty high level, sort of bit of an overview of stuff, but with an idea that maybe we can, discuss at various different points throughout this. If something comes up that you want to, ask a question about, or comments that you have, I guess within reason, to make sure we actually get home in time for dinner eventually, do feel free to throw your hands up. It's not going to throw me too much off my my scheme. Now, what I want to do first, though, is pass around these stimuli. So these are objects that induce something called the size-weight illusion. The crux here, it's not like some big surprise, is that these two things weigh the same amount as one another. They each weigh exactly 213 grams, but this little one is going to feel heavier than this big one. Resist the urge to unscrew these, because lead shot will fall everywhere, and then Max will be devastated that the lab is covered in lead. But let's try this now, right? This is a reasonably compelling sensation for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so passing around just so everyone can experience these while I'm doing the generic introduction to all of this kind of stuff. So virtual reality, I would define as interacting with a computer-generated environment. And it's the interacting part that I myself am particularly interested in. I'm a cognitive psychologist who examines human hands and how they interact with the world, not just to manipulate things, but to experience the world as well. Virtual reality has had this big awakening when all of a sudden it was something that you could do at the Max Planck, maybe Birmingham, and then all of a sudden everyone has virtual reality, not just in their house, but also in their research laboratories and things like that. It's not just a consumer tool, but has become a big training tool, a big experience that people will throw into all these other industries. So this is a company called Resol that is making billions off the Premier League by suggesting you can train football this way. The world of medicine has been playing virtual reality probably for the longest time of any of the the disciplines that are interested in teaching and learning, and immersive virtual reality is a core part of many North American surgical training residencies. And there's also really interesting versions of virtual reality. This video is glitching out in quite an interesting way, but this is a shadow robot that is sensing the touch on those little fingertips when it interacts with things and sending it back to the user. So this idea of virtual reality not just being a visual experience, but a full multi-sensory experience if we choose to deliver those senses to people. And it's a kind of key part of communication as well. This is the other part of virtual reality that's really being realized a little bit more. Being in a room with someone a very long way away in a way that's fundamentally different than a Teams meeting. You really do feel that sort of proximity of, if I stand a little bit too close to someone and they start to feel uncomfortable about that, you get that sort of sensation in virtual reality as well, and in quite an interesting way. And I'm interested in virtual reality from a couple of empirical perspectives. First of all, I'm interested in a fairly functional sense of whether it's a useful tool. Virtual reality has definitely been sold to us as it's going to change the world, it's going to change everything about everything. But those of us who have been around long enough have experienced those sort of technological narratives over and over again. But understanding what it is useful for in modern society is, a core practical element. And I hopefully can give some interesting examples of where I think it could be useful here. But as a scientist, I'm probably a little bit more interested in fundamentally what happens when we put in a virtual reality headset to our ability to perceive the worlds around us and, to move and interact with stuff. Are we interacting in exactly the same way? Seems fairly unlikely, but understanding what is different and what gets broken and what gets changed, that's really where my love for virtual reality research goes into. So I'm going to start off on that side of things here. Now, I drifted into virtual reality as a scientific tool because it was just this cool way to be able to manipulate stuff about the environment whilst, sort of measuring things as you go. You're wearing a headset that's measuring the position of your head. You're probably holding controllers that are measuring the positions of your hands. So it kind of had this whole package of stuff built in there. And, there are nice VR headsets with eye tracking built in, which, from a technical eye tracking perspective is quite nice because this thing is stuck to the front of your head, so it can't wobble around. And you don't need a chin rest or anything like that to engage with this type of measurement. And I'm interested in, fundamentally, how does the stuff in our brain, so the cognitive things, interact with the inputs from our different sensations, so our eyes, our fingertip afferents, our proprioceptive apparatus, and all of those sorts of things to scaffold our perception of stuff and control our actions. So I take people in the lab, I make them pick things up with little force transducer handles attached to the top, and get them to report how heavy stuff feels and how different things affect the gripping. So let's start off with some of the fundamental research I've done using virtual reality as a simple experimental tool to understand human perception. And I've been doing this in the context mostly of the size-weight illusion, so those stimuli that have been passed around that maybe everyone's had a chance to play with by this point. These are now Alan's stimuli. I'm gifting them to him. So anytime you want to play with these, you can just come up to the Active Touch Lab and visit them. The simple crux of this experience is that, an object's mass will affect how heavy it feels, obviously, but other things will affect how heavy it feels. In this case, is volume. And, you know, in the lab, we do this by filling up stuff with things that are more dense, look more or less dense looking than the outside appearance seems like it's going to be. So I might do a situation where someone will have these objects that are all adjusted to weigh 700 grams. And then with some fairly simple psychophysics, people will be reaching out, picking up these objects, and then reporting with a numerical value how heavy they feel. So big object feels pretty light, 3 out of 10. Small object, heavier. And you can really make these probably feel about twice as heavy as one another, even though they have exactly the same mass. That's an astonishingly compelling illusion that's been around for well over 150 years by this point. Now, we can kind of get into the weeds about a discussion about what causes this, but that's probably a talk for another day and maybe for a different audience. But the answer, at least at a descriptive level, is that it's probably something to do with our expectations. So in the real world, big stuff is usually heavier than small stuff. That's a statistical association that probably exists out there. So what we experience is, ooh, that's lighter than I expected it to be, or that's heavier than I expected it to be. And because we have no internal apparatus for directly detecting how heavy things feel, that's a psychologically constructed experience, we, for some reason, experience this integration of the real mass and what we expected it to be contrasted. Now, you can drive expectations a whole number of different ways. So I can look at these objects sitting there on the table, but I could also close my eyes and feel these objects with my hands. Those are both expectations about how heavy they're going to be before I pick them up, before I experience the mass of them. And I was really quite interested at the time of doing these experiments, which of our senses do we believe the most? This idea that one sense can refer and have an impact on a different sense seemed like a really powerful, indication of the truth of our sensory inputs in some senses, the sort of power for it to be referred in this way. Now, people have been doing experiments a little bit like this in the halcyon days before virtual reality existed, simply by removing different sensory inputs. So here, this nice study by Ellis and Liederman to understand whether we care about our tactile sense of size or our visual sense of size to induce the size-weight illusion, did it by removing different cues. So either picking these things up on a tray, so you can see how different they are, or on a piece of string and, or with eyes closed and feeling them and stuff like that. So all the sorts of obvious multisensory combinations you could imagine. And they found rather curiously that the haptic illusion, so what they call the haptic illusion, but what I would call the tactile illusion, so feeling the size differences and then picking them up, that yields a really big size weight illusion. If you don't get to feel the size differences, you pick them up on a piece of string or something like that, so you've just got the visual size differences, that gives a far more modest size weight illusion, as indexed by a shallower slope here in this relationship between the volume and the perceived mass. But if you look and feel the size differences, you'd probably predict that's going to give the biggest size weight illusion, right? But oddly not. It gives an illusion that is pretty much just the same as if your eyes were closed. So it seems like vision is adding nothing to the party.
That's the first time I see.
Exactly, right? This goes completely against what we expect to see in the context of multisensory inputs and perception, which is all about vision dominates everything, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
But, this isn't a putting stuff in competition with each other kind of experiment. And when your eyes are closed or when you're lifting on a tray, you don't have a great sense of what's being filled in. But, virtual reality allows us to pretty neatly put all of these things in direct conflict with one another. So here in my lab, we're tracking the positions of differently sized objects and giving them the visual appearance of something that is different than the physical size that they actually have. And the nice thing about working with 3D printed objects is that you can put the STL file that creates the physical print directly into Unity and create stuff that is the same size. Although that's a weirdly complicated thing.
This is dynamic. You can also talk about the speed in which things are.
Exactly. Although I would say I completely gloss over that side of things. And really the experience is purely one of feeling like the stuff that you're seeing is the stuff that you are touching. And in this sort of experience, which we would call mixed reality, it's a very compelling experience. People don't really miss the fact that in the experiments, they can't really see their hands or anything like that. This is the way the tasks look in an experimental setting. Reach out, pick it up, and give a rating of how heavy it feels. Across 3 different conditions that I've pretty much set up, I would say. Condition where we have the virtual world replicated, the physical world replicated in the virtual world. 3 differently sized objects in the physical world that look the same sizes as they are in the virtual environment. So, congruent situation. Condition 2, where we have things that feel different sizes, because they actually are, but look as if they're all the same size. So no size weight illusion from vision, but a size weight illusion from touch. And the obvious final one, 3 things that are the same size and look as if they have different sizes. This last condition, incidentally, is a classic virtual reality, is my virtual reality good enough kind of setup that people have been using for decades, actually, to see if you can induce a size weight illusion in this kind of way. Have people lift up each of these objects in each of these conditions 10 times a piece in a jumbled up order in a fairly simple psychology sorts of experiments, giving a number on every single trial that represents how heavy every lift feels, in a way that allows us to calculate fairly simply the magnitude of the size weight illusion everyone feels. I think this graph's a bit clunky to sit and look through, but if we can just take the average heaviness for the small object, subtract the average heaviness from the large object, and plot this across each of our 3 different conditions as an index of how big the size weight illusion is in each of these conditions, we can see a pretty compelling set of data here, whereby the condition where the objects are physically the same size but look different sizes yields a modest, but very clearly there, size weight illusion. Anything above 0 is a size weight illusion. The condition where they all feel different sizes, because they are, but look the same size, yields a bigger size weight illusion still. So this is congruent with this Ellison-Lederman narrative here. But where things start to break apart is when we have this congruent condition here, where things feel and look different sizes from one another. It's a bigger illusion still. And in fact, the effect sizes for that final bar there are almost perfectly the effect sizes of those 2 ones added together. So more like one might traditionally imagine in a multi-sensory cue combination study. So tactile size cues induce a stronger illusion than visual size cues, but things get different than the classic psychophysical studies here, showing that vision is not really redundant, at least in the context of this kind of paradigm. And we've been taking this narrative forward, looking at not just issues related to object size, but also object material perception here. You can, just like have expectations about the sizes of objects and their weights, have different expectations about the material properties of objects and their weights. And you can induce a modest, but still perceptible illusion by having things that look as if they are made of stuff that is heavier or lighter than other things. So here our participant is interacting and feeling the surface texture of 3 objects that all feel the same as one another. But in the virtual world, they all look as if they have different material properties than one another. And again, you can induce almost exactly the same effects that I've described for the size weight illusion. I don't want to get too hung up on the details of those experiments. I've got the slides if anyone wants to chat about these at the end. But I think it really just serves as a nice starting point here to allow us to show how this kind of task can be used to complement traditional psychophysical method experiments. With the big caveat, of course, that, well, we've got very different resolutions of the systems at play here. These virtual reality displays, even nowadays, are still pretty low resolution compared to, the native resolution of the human eye. And this was done with an Oculus Rift CV1 and then an Oculus Rift S. So pretty low resolution stuff.
Do you think it's even dependent on the resolution?
I don't know. I think these are pretty easy experiments to be doing moving forward. And, with the headsets just getting better over time, these are really nice natural experiments to just do. So I'm hoping to roll out different versions of these moving forward anyway.
You could have done that even without VR, just have boxes. 3 boxes of different materials where the weight is.
Yeah. But it becomes this sort of proof of principle for being able to do these, what would be pretty computer-based or at least fairly constrained perceptual experiments in a more ecologically valid kind of way, to start to examine how the different weightings of the senses might vary across pathology or age or something like that. But this has become a sort of a broader question as far as I'm concerned, because I'm not that interested inherently about the weightings of the different sensory inputs. I think that's stuff that's kind of interesting to me, but not where my core interest lies. And I'm really interested in this relationship between how we perceive and how we act, and breaks between those two things as well. And there's been some suggestions from the literature that perhaps the way that we engage with our environment in virtual reality, which often has limited visual resolution, but also no real haptic feedback. So, you know, a very fundamentally different experience than physical interactions in the world might just simply shift our brain to operating in a whole different mode. And this has been framed here in a fairly classic psychology neuropsych, two visual streams, Milner and Goodale type narrative, where the part of our brain that normally is being underpinning our subjective experience of the world might be guiding the more implicit sensory motor visually guided actions. But I almost think the model that underpins this is kind of agnostic to the bigger question of, you know, what are the consequences for perceiving the world and acting on the world in a virtual environment? And there's really just not a whole lot of stuff out there yet, largely because it's quite challenging to measure really fundamental things in VR, although a lot of research groups are now pushing in this kind of direction. But conveniently enough, I'm one of the few people who do work on grip force control, on being another fairly obvious one in the room here. But when people pick up objects like this for the first time, their expectations about how heavy these things are going to be guide the way that they pick them up. And some of you might have experienced this themselves. When you pick them up, you kind of jerk this one up in the air and struggle to pick this one up off the table. And this is the same thing, you know, if your friend has a mountain bike that's better than you, that's made of carbon fiber, you jerk it up in the air. In the lab, we can induce these things so easily. When people pick up the large object, we measure the force trace from the force transducers, we get this whopping great big peak. Whereas the small object, even though it has the same mass, is interacted with in a very different kind of way. And it's these rates of change, the steepnesses of these slopes, that gives this really nice peek behind the curtain of the sort of planning aspect of the sensory motor control. Now, we don't keep making those mistakes over and over again. We adapt and the motor system learns, but that, again, is a talk for another day. I think this behavior, though, is really what I was interested in examining in the context of virtual reality.
Just a question, they're not converging to the same pressure eventually because it's the same weight.
Well, this is gripping force, not loading force. So if it was, you know, but more critically, this is just something I drew in PowerPoint.
I see.
So I suppose I probably could try to make those things. But I would say the gripping force probably wouldn't typically converge on the same weight on the first trial. Maybe it would. It's, yeah. I don't know. I can probably adjust that, though, to make it a prettier visual. You know, this can be framed in the ever popular Bayesian kind of framework here about, you know, maybe we prioritize our prior, or maybe we prioritize our sensory information in a virtual reality context. And you can really make an argument for either of those cases as far as I'm concerned. But the key thing here is that we can use these sorts of frameworks to make sensible interpretations of what might well be happening in terms of perception and action in the context of these experiments once we put the VR headset on. And again, I don't want to spend too long getting bogged down on experimental details. Here, people are lifting 4 different objects, and now we're tracking the movements with HTC Vive trackers rather than the motion capture system in the laboratory, because that is quite nice and lo-fi and works almost as well, actually. And looking at how people experience the size-weight illusion and this gripping behavior that I showed there in virtual reality in the real world. Yeah, and that's what this looks like from an experimental perspective. We're not tracking the hands because that is a total nightmare to integrate into this kind of stuff. although one day I would hope to. But we are tracking the position of the wrists, and because the objects are always in the same place, people have no trouble getting their hand to do that precision grip over and over again.
So why do you bother to put the tracker on the hand?
Because I did the first time I did one of these studies, and it seemed like that was something to continue on with. It's a pretty low impact thing to do. Also, when people are in VR and you just put them in the VR headset and they're in this world, which is a very nice virtual replication of the lab that was created by Jack Evans, actually, who many of you know. They do want to kind of wave their arms around and sort of be in the moment. So giving people that little tethering to their physical reality without letting them touch my stimuli.
White thing is the hand.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the wrist tracker.
Yeah.
So again, just So this is data I've never presented before because it was only collected like, a couple of weeks ago. We've had this as a stage 1 registered report for some time and only, really just got around to collecting the data. But the short answer is we see a pretty dramatic falling off of the size weight illusion in virtual reality. It shrinks down quite a lot from the virtual reality that is experienced in the physical environment. This, I would say, is probably to be expected based on what other people have done in the virtual reality size weight illusion. The narrative is the more realistic the environment, the bigger the size weight illusion becomes. Maybe that's down to your ability to figure out the size volume differences between these things, which you can do somewhat more easily with really high resolution input. But I'm not really sure I buy that in the context of this kind of study, or whether something is just changing, you're operating in a slightly safer mode to do with precision of priors and things like that.
Anytime in the real world in a dark room,
yeah,
would that reduce my?
Well, if you're feeling the size differences with your hands, it's way bigger. If you're not experiencing the size differences with your hands and you can't see the size differences, these feel exactly the same. But you really need to be in a dark room with no idea about what's in front of you, because even if I tell you one of those is bigger than the other, that's enough to induce a size weight illusion that is a bit modest. But in this context, the size weight illusion becomes a really strong index of the information that your system is gathering in through whatever possible mechanism it can about the likely weights of these objects.
Just remind me, how did you compute the size weight illusion score again?
So this is just basically the average weight given to the large objects versus subtracted from the average weight given to the large objects, the small objects. So yeah, positive values indicate a experienced size weight illusion. I mean, what's notable as well is there's a couple of people who are experiencing no or even an inverted size weight illusion in this situation, which you almost never see in the physical environment. I'm not sure I'd hang too much on that side of things. Even with those two outliers removed, there's still a significant difference there, and the base factor is somewhere around 28. So it's a very strong bit of evidence for there being a difference in this case, which is in pretty stark contrast to what we see for that grip force behavior that I showed you the first time around, the peaks in the peak steepness of those slopes. Here we see no difference whatsoever between the forces that are used, this propensity to predict the world in virtual reality and in the physical environment.
Which makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think I was pretty surprised at this. I think it's always nice to see a dissociation between two variables, particularly in the context of perception and action here. But I was really expecting there to be a pretty fundamental difference in behavior of the grip forces in this particular context. Now, there are some other behavioral differences that are not captured by this measure at all. There's a general propensity to grip things harder, which for those of us who have played in the grip force world for a bit would probably expect. When you're not certain about stuff, you tend to just grip harder because there's really not much of a cost associated with squeezing force transducers very hard. And that's maybe not a particularly interesting facet of this. But in terms of the predictive behavior, that's completely unchanged. We're still writing up this, though. We're still trying to sort of figure out what this looks like in the context of a paper, but it's a pretty compelling package of data that we're pretty excited to be writing up here.
To me, that's good because that reinforces that there's a huge perceptual effect now.
Yeah.
The behavior is the same, but conceptually they have a huge difference. So that's nice.
Yeah, yeah.
Reinforcing evidence for.
Yeah, I mean, you try not to go into a study hoping things will pan out some way. And this was one of these studies where I kind of thought any outcome is going to be pretty interesting. And because it was a registered report, we were really forced into having this table of predictions and what they would mean from a theoretical perspective, which is not generally the way that I do things up front. But it was, a pretty satisfying process. It's been a long time coming, this paper, I feel.
Have you tried correlating like each participant, like to see what's happening?
I don't think we've correlated these measures. We did correlate presence and stuff like that. I've got graphs that I'll show at the end if anyone wants to see it, but there's no correlation with presence and any of these magnitude scores or change scores, if you want to look at them that way.
One additional metric you could look at if you haven't already, which you get for free, is that arm tracker.
Yeah.
To see the acceleration of the arm and the lift of the two conditions. Maybe there's something that is also different in those behavior.
Well,
maybe not. I don't know.
Well, these are 6 degree of freedom force transducers. So we've got the loading force and the loading force rate, which should be that direct correlate of acceleration. But I do think lifting height, for example, would be a pretty key thing to look for in this as well. It's the big problem we're having at the moment actually is how to segment this paper up, and what is the core thing that goes in the paper without it being a paper that goes on forever, and what is supplementary material or what is pilot for the next kind of thing. But I think we're gonna just kind of put as much in as we can and let the reviewers tell us what probably should make the cut as far as they're concerned, because they've been with us since the beginning in this process.
Yeah.
So
another thing on that graph you can look at is the time to peak. That's something I've done with Alan. So how long does it take to get to the peak force? Never mind what the peak force is.
Yeah.
But just the time it takes. It's kind of like a correlate of the acceleration.
Yeah. It's I guess like the loading force rate, but in this case with grip, we see the same pattern of data with loading force rate as well for those who are. Yeah.
With the size weight negative score, I suppose it raises the possibility that people are being tricked and be I suppose that, so I quite like Max's idea of kind of correlating between the real world and the virtual world, because then if you have consistent individuals, then you sort of feel more convinced that it's about weight rather than some difference about the virtual versus real world.
Yeah, and it has been shown, I guess, in some slightly weirder context, that the forces can have a knock-on effect on the size weight illusion. And you can have people lift in such a way that they experience almost a null size weight illusion. And well, I've never seen it reversed around, but however, I could well imagine perhaps that negative dot down there being correlated with that negative dot down there only in virtual reality, but not the physical environment, which becomes another super weird dissociation between what perception and action are sort of doing in contexts.
Just to make sure, so this one thing always grab on a fixed.
Exactly. It's the same haptics.
Always the same haptics, just from the visual. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. Because I'm trying to think, would I expect the size weight illusion thing to be any different if it's an interaction like this or not?
How accurate is the position and motion in the VR?
Yeah, pretty perfect feeling, subjectively anyway. And we've not really pushed it around, but
no residue of, say, different visual accelerations or latency in the acceleration that could affect the sense of weight.
Not that's detectable to me. And that latency thing is a key indicator of sense of weight. I mean, I guess the key thing to bear in mind here is that, well, I was going to say there's a within subject, but that doesn't really address your question here. I suppose I don't have an answer for that. I'm not sure why that would reduce the size weight illusion, though.
If you have some latency, it feels like it's heavier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, they both feel like they're equally heavier in this context. In the size weight. So the magnitude of the illusion being that effect shouldn't change the magnitude of the illusion, but should reduce the overall, should increase the overall heaviness of everything in VR compared to the physical environment.
True. Although you might have anticipated that for the big one, and the small one is coming into the
HTC Vive packs for about 240 hertz. So unless your PC was lagging behind on
but the HTC Vive is on the hand, not on the object.
No, I say it's on the objects as well.
On the bottom.
I didn't saw that.
Yeah.
Okay.
In this last version, everything's being tracked with Vive, nothing being tracked with OptiTrack in my lab. All right, hold those thoughts though, because we will be here forever if I indulge too many questions. However, the next stuff I guess is a bit less contentious and maybe a little bit more obvious. I work in the sports science department, so I'm forced to do endless sports research, but whatever, I've kind of come around to it, particularly golf putting, right? Because you do motor control research and there's infinite degrees of freedom for everything and no one cares anyway. But it turns out golf putting is very constrained. It's still a visual motor task. People get paid millions to do it really, really well. So, there's a whole swathe of interest around being able to perform stuff like this in VR well. And, the stuff you measure kinematically and how it relates to good performance, it's so simple. Unlike grasping, where, there is no good grasping performance. It's just, differences. You can also measure people's eye tracking in the context of golfing. And, it turns out I work in a department where people have made their careers measuring the duration of the final fixation before they swing the putter at the ball, so-called quiet eye duration. And, the bottom line is it's a task that's really well understood in the physical environment. So it's quite easy to put in VR and then a good opportunity to examine this. So we were lucky enough to work with a chap called Jack Brooks at the University of Leeds. Now, at the time, bear with me, this was super impressive VR. I realize now it looks pretty rudimentary, but, it allows us to track the position of a controller and hit a virtual ball towards a virtual target and measure the distance from the hole in VR. It's a perfect training simulator. Great. First up, we started figuring out whether this, would capture elements of real golfing. So does it have construct validity? Easy way to do that is look at, do experts do better in this than novices? So we did a fairly simple experiment where people got to, get in the VR headset, experience it with a bit of familiarization, and then we measured their performance on a real putting green and a virtual reality, that simulator there, averaged their radial error, so their average distance to the hole over those 10 putts as an index of their performance. And then we asked them to say how far away they thought the hole was on every trial as well. And, lo and behold, the expert golfers outperformed the novice golfers. You can see in the real world here on the right, they outperformed them pretty substantially. So smaller is closer to the hole and better performance. Virtual reality, we're seeing the same sort of thing, although with a lot more overlap, which I think is quite an interesting point, but probably what you would have expected from something like this.
How good is the haptics that you're rendering? Do you feel?
No haptics at all. We're holding a golf club, a physical golf club, with an HTC Vive tracker attached to the bottom.
Got it.
And that's what you're doing in both conditions. But there's no rendering of the ball. There's no contact with the ball. That's a different study, which again I can talk about at the end if people want, but doesn't make the cut for this this narrative, sadly. All right, so experts putt more accurately in VR, just like in the real world. So this seems like it's going to be an okay experimental tool to use. Experts also judge distance more accurately in VR, just like in the real world. So we see the novices doing the fairly classic underestimation of distance in virtual reality, and experts not so much. This is not that interesting. This is, experts knowing what 10-foot putts look like more than novices do. But at least everything is going in the direction one would hope if you're a virtual reality researcher and also a sports science researcher. So now we can start asking bigger questions about whether you can become a better golfer by training in virtual reality. We got a fairly convoluted research design looking at novice golfer performance, get them to look at their performance in the physical lab. So they come in and they do a pre-test, just like in that study I showed you there. They pop towards the hole and we measure their distance to see how rubbish they are beforehand. And then we have half of them put on the VR headset and do 40 putts in that virtual simulation over and over again. The other half put on, just do that in the physical environment. So we're setting them up against the gold standard kind of training, if you like, and then have them come back 2 days later and see how good they are at putting in the physical environment again. And we find that the real world training, those that have the real world training, they get better at this golf putting task, which is reassuring. VR training, not really, though. There's no significant improvement there when we look at these different scores. There's no interaction, though, between these two things either. So it's kind of hard to draw really concrete conclusions about what is going on here.
Just a question, what is improvement, the delta between the error before and after?
Exactly. Yeah. With that sort of black bar on those right-hand side graphs being higher, meaning there's a greater degree of improvement. So they are on average closer to the hole with their 10 putts.
So they both were tested on the real world?
Yes.
Have you also tried to test again on the virtual?
Yeah. I have a slide for that as well. And that's the longer version of the experiment that people actually did. And, half of them, well, we looked at their VR and their real world training before and after. And we see a pattern of data that's perhaps not entirely congruent with this. I'll show the slide at the end as well. But again, I felt that from a narrative perspective, it was just a little bit too convoluted to present all of this stuff at the same time. So we don't see a whole ton of evidence here that virtual reality is going to be a useful thing to learn to play golf in, which, I think is a bit of a shame from some perspectives. That certainly goes against what many virtual reality companies, particularly those that manufacture sports games, are telling you. And remember, we're doing this with a far more real setup than any VR game is going to have, holding a physical golf putter and putting towards things. But the other promise of virtual reality is that perhaps it is something that could be the practice tool for professionals. So when you're stuck in your hotel room and you can't get out on the driving range, or you're on the plane to an event, you can be engaging in the task in VR in somehow or other in a way that is useful for the maintenance of the skill. But of course, it could equally be very bad for that skill. It could be a particularly problematic thing to do in this context. So we came at this with a reasonably critical eye. When you work in a sports science department, everyone's an athlete, so you can recruit these elite level athletes fairly trivially, which is nice. So we had 18 expert golfers with a lower than 5 handicap who played for the university first team. We had them come into our research lab, and then we had them get really used to putting in the research lab. We have a research lab with a golf putting green, as I probably should have mentioned at the beginning. So they putted towards the hole in the physical world 40 times. So, they got really used to it. Then we had them do 10 baseline putts. Then we had them put on the VR headset. And then they do a bunch of stuff in VR, putting towards that hole in VR 40 times now. They take off the VR headset. We look at their putting performance in the real world again. So what is the consequence of that acute dose of virtual reality for someone with a pre-existing level of expertise in a task? And the answer is absolutely nothing. Okay, so really no hint whatsoever. People are performing just as well before as they are after. But, for, I guess, the newer trainees in the room, this is the perils of looking at average of 10 trials, which we love to do in psychology, right? Let's actually zoom in, right? Because a lot can happen over those average 10 trials. When we start to look at people's putting performance in terms of their radial error across each one of those trials, including the trial immediately after they take the VR headset off, we see they're catastrophically worse immediately after taking the VR headset off. And this deficit in performance doesn't last very long. And in fact, they bounce right back to their average baseline performance, that you can see in the green here, after just one trial of getting used to the real world once again. But acutely, there's something pretty dramatically going on. And because we were measuring their gaze behavior in the physical environment with a head-mounted eye tracker, because that's what my colleagues love to do, we did see these big differences in the duration of the final fixation, the so-called quiet eye duration, in this putt immediately after taking off the VR headset. So perhaps some transient disruption of the visual motor control that underpins successful golfing performance. So pretty nice, clean narrative there. That suggests, I suppose, if we wanted a headline to take away from this, you really should not be wearing your VR headset before you take that putt to visualize successful performance or something like that. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about here is some of the work we've done in a clinical context. This work has been a bit of a mixture of work as a motion tracking device and work as a tool to mess around with embodiment. It's the embodiment side of things that I've become super interested in more recently. So we've had some, I would say, reasonably ill-fated attempts to try to characterize motor behavior on batteries of tasks. So here we've tried to create a virtual reality version of something called the Movement ABC, which is a school-based task that's used to diagnose dyspraxic children. And, there's some interesting challenges with how you take a physical world test battery and put it into the virtual environment, and what things you can do well and what things you can't do well. I mean, the short answer is we have not developed a diagnostic tool for dyspraxia in virtual reality yet. I still think there's some interesting potentials in this area. But one space we've had a lot more, I think, success in, not least because it's had a sort of longer lead in, is to do with the circle drawing metrics that have been developed by a PhD student of mine, Jack Evans, who's defending his PhD on Monday. Now, his PhD was supposed to focus on, in the lab, can we use virtual reality to track performance in stroke survivors and quantify their deficits, their improvements as a function of different physiotherapies and stuff like that. But then the pandemic came along and Jack was no longer allowed to be in rooms with old people measuring anything about anyone. But there were, conveniently enough, 10 million or so Meta Quest 2 users at the time who had all decided during the pandemic they wanted to try out virtual reality. So what we did was Jack created a virtual reality game. It looks a bit like this, where someone was in a cool room. Oh, it's rendered a bit weirdly. There we go. And had to draw a circle. You can probably just imagine what that looks like without it looking all garbled. And had people collect circles with their dominant and non-dominant hands. So not stroke survivors, not anyone neuroatypical, just individuals, to see if we can quantify the differences between the dominant and non-dominant hand. There's a simple, well, this is a pre-existing difference that if we can capture this difference, that's probably going to be a pretty good indicator of this tool's potential clinical utility. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to present any of the data here, but this has become a bit of a cottage industry almost. It worked really nicely from a remote data collection perspective, which had a bunch of weird, interesting technical challenges to overcome that has formed this very computer science aspect of Jack's PhD, which I've really enjoyed being engaged with, actually. But we've been able to bring it back into the lab since the pandemic, particularly working with children. This has been a really nice task. Trying to find something a kid will want to do is an inherent challenge, but people like drawing circles, right? It's just one of those things that's fun. And everyone understands what it is to draw a circle, and everyone wants to do the task well. People don't want to mess around or anything like that. They want to draw the perfect circle. And we've worked with children as young as 8 years old in this task who, found it acceptable, usable, and, even stuff like the weight of the VR headset and the duration of the task itself, it seemed to sit in this sort of sweet spot where kids could manage it, such that we were able to work with a group of children who had cerebral palsy and, basically find very strong correlations with their upper limb visual motor performance from some of the metrics that we can extract from the MetaQuest here. Here we have their score on the box and block tests, and how many blocks can you move from one side to the other, and sort of nicely validated clinical task here. So that's a kind of fairly exciting aspect to this, but really it's this motor control research lab in a box. The fact that these cameras we see dotted around here, like tens of thousands of pounds, ages to set up, tons of wires, tons of grief, and tons of technical skill and expertise. Whereas if a VR headset can get kind of close to that level of precision, the value to cost ratio of this thing is it's a really nice ratio. And we really had a great opportunity to work with a master student who's a physiotherapist from India who was super keen to just take some VR headsets back to India with her during the winter break. And she collected data from 60 children with various movement difficulties in schools across the country. And again, there's no science there. This is just a simple proof of principle that you can take this stuff into places way outside of the normal remit of a motor control researcher, or even a clinician hoping to do a formal diagnosis, and capture some really incredible quantitative data that could, be a very useful adjunct to any clinical stuff.
Don't keep us in attention. Was there any difference between the dominant hand and non-dominant hand?
Yes. So basically, people were just as accurate with both hands, but drew faster with the dominant hand.
Okay.
So in a self-paced task, people choose to make that, choice to prioritize speed over accuracy. And a bunch of Jack's PhD was trying to mess around with that a little bit more as well, seeing if we could, set timing constraints on there. Will accuracy differences start to emerge that could maybe be a bit richer in terms of data that we could use machine learning to segregate these two different types of data from? The answer is maybe at this point. It's certainly not as clean as we've been able to get rid of the movement differences, but Jack's PhD after the dominant, non-dominant hand thing did shift much more in a clinical direction. And he was very keen to do some work with stroke survivors and dyspraxic adults during his PhD. So that was the direction he ended up drifting in. All right, last thing I'm going to present here is around hand tracking. As I have alluded to before, I'm kind of obsessed with the idea of hand tracking. I think this is the coolest thing that we do in virtual reality. And like many VR researchers, I'm kind of sick of virtual reality. I don't really want to be in a VR headset all that much and, whatever. I like having my hands tracked in VR. It's a very cool experience. And this is sort of one of the earliest hand physics lab demos. This experience where you just reach out and interact with the mirror reflection of yourself. And this phantom touch you get from this touching yourself is the most salient fake tactile experience I've ever had in virtual reality. So, track this down. I can't find it in the modern hand physics lab, so I think it only exists in this demo version somewhere. But it's a great experience, and I'm sure someone could just code up some sort of mirror reflection.
What happened there? I mean,
so here
the finger touched the palm, or the other hand is touching?
Neither. So this is just a reflection of yourself.
Yes.
Nothing is touching anything, but you feel like you are touching something on your fingertips, or at least I did, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And, there is some beginning of the experiments on this, phantom touch that's been done out of Buckingham and Christian Clay's research group. But, this is I think a largely unidentified area.
And if you take the same hand, same tracking, just touch a wall, it won't give you the phantom touch.
I think it does for some people. I mean, there's a whole behind the scenes forums of people talking about the phantom touch they've experienced, which often gets, inevitably a kind of sexual element to it that people are desperate to talk about. But feeling like your avatar is being touched and experiencing something like a tactile sensation is pretty commonly reported. I myself never experienced it.
That's what I was saying. I never had We always had to put some kind of additional sensor to convince people that they're touching.
Yeah.
For me, it was more like not so much tactile. It was more kinesthetic. So I could feel, especially when I was doing this.
Yeah.
I was like, "Come on, let go." So I could feel a bit of force.
Yeah.
That was really strange.
Interesting. Okay.
But like the cool things you can do with virtual reality is and hand tracking is really mess around with the visual properties of the hands. And our hands are the special thing to humans. These are the thing that sort of sets us apart from everything else. The body part we are most familiar with visually. We spend all day interacting with them. And you can do some like pretty wacky stuff. So here I've extended the index finger of my friend Sam's hand here. And this wasn't staged, but he's so compelled by this that he feels he just has a check. Is it really there? couldn't be a more perfect video basically for this kind of point.
Especially if you add another feedback like the Pinocchio nose.
Yeah. But this is stuff that's been really driven forward by Caitlin Naylor, who's recently defended in the context of a pain condition called complex regional pain syndrome, which is a pretty grotesque pain disorder leading to really dramatic crippling pain, but also a pretty dramatic variety of body representation disorders. So, you know, this idea that if you close your eyes and you've got to try and imagine what your hand looks or feels like, it's going to look reasonably accurate. Although it turns out that even people without any pain or body representation disorders have these strange biases. But individuals with complex regional pain syndrome really feel dramatically like either parts of their fingers are lost or damaged or inflamed or different colors or missing segments of them. And the early part of Caitlin's PhD was survey work showing that the degree of body representation disturbance seems like it correlates with the degree of pain that these individuals have, or at least the degree of disability that they have when doing various different tasks. So she became very keen to see if we can try and address these body representation disorders with, tasks that would allow people to embody their perfect idealized hand. So she worked at developing this dashboard that would allow people to, while embodying virtual hands like this, which is this really instant feeling of these are mine, like nothing else in virtual reality, or, nothing like the rubber hand illusion or any of those effects. This really, these are mine, I'm wiggling them around, allowing people to change some of the more basic properties of them, like here, the color, here, the size, not just of the hands, but of various different effectors. Going to make the finger a bit longer in a moment. Yeah, so the little finger's got wider here. And create these rather strange looking hands. Or, even remove fingers altogether. Where I think, we're just removing these fingers. This I find a pretty distressing sensation to engage with in virtual reality. And not just the fact that you're missing a finger, but watching bits of your body disappear while you're wielding them around in front of you. It's a weird, intense experience. Now, there's no scientific, hurrah moment I'm going to give you here. We're certainly not at the stage where we can say whether this is a treatment. But what Caitlin has been able to do is work with a bunch of people who have CRPS, 4 of them, in a PPIE context, to develop this tool into something that they would find useful from a clinical perspective and that a clinician could potentially use and that we could use in the experimental context. So this is the physical hand of an individual with complex regional pain syndrome. Everyone has a different set of physical and also internal representation prognosis. This individual's right hand is kind of bent over like a claw. That's how they're sort of stuck at the moment. They are able to visualize a typical hand pretty well. There's no cognitive misunderstanding of what a hand should look like. We get them to build their ideas of what these things should look like in the hand tracking tool. Their distorted perception, so what their hand actually feels like to them at the moment, pretty well matches onto their physical hand, that same clawed over feeling, which took a while to get coded in properly, but also slightly bluer and colder feeling than the other hand. And then the desired perception, so what it is that they want. And you don't really see it that well from this video. So let's just look at a couple of videos here. So this is their current perception of their hand. And the cool thing about this is not them doing it. This is me embodying the saved file of the hand they have created. So I can experience what their body representation disorder is like. And that's just the coolest part of this aspect as far as I'm concerned. And this is what they want. They don't want a normal hand. They don't want a standard looking hand. They want something that in this case totally counteracts the deficit that they're experiencing, not just in the physical, but also in their internal body representation. And across Caitlin's survey work, which is hundreds of patients, and even the 4 partners who engaged with this, everyone had a different sort of disorder and everyone wants something different as a consequence. Some want the hand to look normal, some want the color changed, but keep the physical visual deformities. Some want the deformities offset by going in the opposite direction, maybe even seeming more deformed than they were before. But it's this individuality that's a kind of key hallmark of what's going on here and what is really missed in the science of this stuff, like mirror box therapy and other sorts of treatments for pain, particularly in a phantom pain context.
So if I'm coming in and I have this pain, and what you generate is a natural looking hand that reacts to my motion. Basically, you map my limited motion to the full motion that looks like a regular hand.
Mhm.
Would that have any effect on the feeling of the pain?
Well, that's what we would hope to discover. I think what I've set up here is that no, that on itself would only help pain in a small subgroup of these individuals. The other parts would be giving people the experience of, what they want or what it is that they already have. So removing that sort of mismatch between the visual and the internal body representation that is thought to maybe maintain the pain.
Well, one thing that you could do is you can use a small dynamic range physically to map to a bigger dynamic range visually, and that might reduce the pain. Not psychology, but actually the fact that you don't move too much reduces the pain. But it's mapped to an actual full behavior of the hand.
Yeah. I would say, though, the goal of this is never going to be to reduce the pain they're experiencing in a VR headset. I think what we're looking for here is a way to slowly reduce the underpinning cause of what that pain is in the physical environment. And if that is a body representation disorder mismatch with the seen stuff, this sort of photo fit idea might allow those discrepant things to become a little bit closer to one another. So that's the theoretical framework on this. Anecdotally, a few of our people said, yeah, my hand feels way better like this, but we were very keen for this not to be a experiment where we are trying to reduce people's pain, because you might similarly increase people's pain, right? And it's a scary world to be working in, this kind of stuff, where people have real drama and damage, but they were so moved at the ability to communicate their deformities to their doctors, their families, and stuff like that. People who just think it's all in their heads. You just can't explain these body representation disorders. It makes no sense to explain to anyone else. But letting people experience that on their behalf really, really moved them as a thing. So it's a pretty cool starting point for all of this stuff. But I'm finally finished. I'm sorry I spoke for so long, guys. But thank you very much for listening. Here's another hand. This one's pretty wacky.
I just had a comment about the golf thing earlier, and this is a mistake I've made before, and I don't know if that applies to media, but it's the number 40, right? Is too few trials. So I've spoken to a lady who does like rehab, like a physio, and she said you need something like 400.
Yeah.
Because like the reason people in the real golf environment improve and not in the VR one is because they already live in this environment. They don't have to train up to it. Whereas in VR, first of all, you have to get used to it. And it requires 100 trials or more just to get used to the VR environment, and then you can train.
No, I totally agree.
That's why you didn't see and I did it with the pool actually.
Yeah.
Same story. I had to increase I couldn't afford 400 trials because of time, but it increased it to 250.
Yeah.
And that's when we started, even just a little bit, started to see effects.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, we've done it with 100 as well, and still no effects. But I think, as you say, you gotta really invest in getting people out of the physical world and into the virtual world if you want to see the consequences of training.
Although you didn't describe, I guess that people that trained in the VR world became better in the VR world, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there is some difference between the representation in the VR world and the real world, that people that trains in VR world sort of have a false train that actually hurt them in the real world.
Yeah.
And once they try to pass in the real world, they compensate for that. And I don't know if this is because the lack of haptics, because the focus is on a different distance to where the ball is. There's many different things that could be a reason.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, it's a very painful independent variable because 30 things are being manipulated simultaneously, and you kind of got to reverse engineer what's the thing perception is caring about. But I'm kind of happy, you know, the discussions we are having earlier. I'm kind of happy doing both of these parts of my job at the same time and allowing them to, you know, meet in the middle ultimately as I sort of build the ground up fundamental stuff and the, you know, the real world. People are making money off virtual reality as a training tool, testing that critically narrative.
It could be, but you need to be aware of the differences and see whatever you train, is that affected by those differences or not?
Yeah. Yeah.
That stuff is fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's the coolest thing I've been involved in. And then
Because
Yes.
Joe will tell you something about the things that we've been doing through my PhD because we haven't published it yet. Waiting for some approval, but it's right up that alley.
Yeah.
Not in the same environment, like thing, but it's more like what Al said, to apply the visual gain to the range of movement that people could do. There's also patients with spasticity. They
Okay.
couldn't actually fully open, but they could open a little bit.
Yeah.
And they were both training at home. So what we did, we gamified the whole thing in VR, and we allowed them to visually, at least in VR, to train fully with their full hand range.
Right.
You know, like a healthy hand. And what happens in the brain is fascinating. So you get sort of a visual motor feedback loop that reinforces that. So that when they take it off after hundreds of trials, 300 trials, they will start actually, they're not feeling the same amount of pain
Yeah.
as they did before, over multiple training sessions.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing you probably see as well, because, the Mimo box thing does work. We didn't invent it, but it does, it's been discovered and it does work. And that's a similar sort of visual motor feedback loop, right? That happens in VR, essentially.
Yeah.
It will work, I think. It's me.
There's also one thing that I found, but that's for doing really fast motions like typing, that your representation of your hands also affect your ability. I mean, it's probably some kind of uncanny valley effect. But for example, if you render your hands and you try to type, or you only render the trapped points, which are the joints, and you try to type, you type better with just the joints rather than the full hand. So again, that because it's a fast action, maybe you reveal that effect.
Yeah.
What did you use with the visualization? Was it the hand lab? Like how did you
No,
the hand?
Ultraleap and Unity.
Oh.
So Ultraleap tracking, there's a nice set of skins that are very realistic seeming. And beyond that, just working with someone to develop that nice sort of clinician friendly dashboard. Beyond that, it's actually pretty rudimentary stuff that we have manipulated. What we really want to do is be able to mess around with texture and stuff like that, because that's a whole other set of problems these individuals have. But that was basically beyond our capabilities at the time. But the hope is we get some good money to follow up on this work. So it feels like a pretty compelling story to be moving forward with. And pain is one of those things that I've come to believe is the big unsolved problem. It's the damage it causes versus how little we understand about it. That gap is bigger than any other gap in this world.
With those hands, have you tried like something like manipulation or like or only wiggling essentially?
No, so Caitlin developed a sort of interaction toolkit using stuff that's kind of built into the Ultraleap SDK. There's no physical interaction, obviously.
So virtual.
So moving virtual boxes from place to place and rotating things around and stuff like that. But I think there's a whole other piece of work about, what is required to embody something that is outside of your natural limits of embodiment, and indeed, what are the natural limits of embodiment of the hand, and that kind of framing of the question. That's really where my interests lie with this particular hand tracking paradigm.
I was wondering whether you adopted some, physiological recording, like scaring like something like, and as an implicit measure of embodiment.
Yeah, no, we haven't yet, and we are generally pretty dissatisfied with all measures of embodiment. That's been the conclusion of Caitlin's PhD either survey stuff or these, I don't know, slightly ham-fisted galvanic skin response type things, or proprioceptive drift, and they're all kind of weird and clunky. Caitlin had, you can maybe kind of see it in some of the things, slot posting and trying to get asking people how far they can post their hands through things, and there's various different versions of this. So this is like donut task here.
So one thing that you mentioned is really, really interesting. I wonder if you actually managed to quantify that. It sort of what I heard from what you say is something like, oh, there is a virtual stretching that helps my pain feeling. Did you actually saw a change? I mean, the fact that people could visually imagine folding the hands in even more than physically possible, it's something that reduced their pain.
So this is 4 people. This is all qualitative stuff.
I see.
So I am reluctant to say anything firmly beyond that. Anecdotally, 3 out of the 4 people said it reduced their pain, the experience. But then again, you're making someone do something super amazing and cool and distracting and whatever.
That's right.
And then
maybe after 5 minutes, the pain will return.
Yeah.
Right?
What this needs is a nice randomized controlled trial relative to something else. That said, the way you treat this is opioids. And, that's a pretty low bar to jump over in terms of how disastrous that is as a treatment mechanism.
Yeah.
So there's even fairly trivial gains are, considering the cost of virtual reality and the enjoyment of this experience, are, well worth it from that ethics perspective. But what we need to be cautious about is inflaming pain, either through excess action or through some hitherto misunderstood psychological mechanism. So it's a kind of slow baby steps, careful engagement with clinicians phase we're at now, once we get money to do so. All right, folks, well, thank you very much for listening.
So thank you, everybody, for speakers. If you have visitors, suggestions for speaker, or you want to present anything, like the series is open and we are looking for speakers, or visit to labs or anything. So thank you for coming.
You know that one where you said